G'day and welcome to Pellowe Talk. My name is Dave Pellowe, and today I've got an exclusive interview with Liz Storer.
Oh, it's not enough to do nothing. It's time for us to do something.
Liz is the National Director of Advance Australia. And Advance Australia is something that's trying to do what a lot of conservatives and Christians have been calling for many, many years. Advance Australia is the right of centre answer to the far left extremist activist group GetUp. If you've heard of GetUp, then you probably have heard of the shenanigans they get up to. And strangely, a lot of people who haven't heard of them or have only heard of them a little bit, in fact, a lot of their supporters just haven't looked that deep or heard that much about them. And so that's actually something that Advance Australia is drawing attention to in itself. But why don't you welcome to Pellowe Talk right now, Liz Storer. Liz, thank you so much for joining us from the other side of the continent, and welcome to Pellowe Talk.
Thanks so much for having me on, Dave. It's great to be here.
Now, tell me about Advance Australia. Tell us, as we just have a look at your website, exactly what Advance Australia exists for and how that mission is going.
So we've been up and running for 18 months now. Advance Australia was launched by my predecessor late 2018 in the hopes of being able to pack a punch in time for the 2009 federal election, which indeed they did, despite being a very young organisation at the time. Did a great job of taking the fight to the left, and we saw quite a few seats won. As you know, it was the surprise victory for mainstream Australia. And
what seats
Advance
were you
Australia,
particularly focusing your efforts on? Because you weren't Australia-wide. A lot of people wouldn't have seen you during that election.
Tony Abbott's seat was definitely one of the hot spots. The lefties obviously were all over that. GetUp was extremely visible.
Yep.
GetUp, as you know, is our lefty counterpart. And indeed, in many ways, GetUp was the inspiration behind getting Advance Australia up off the ground. I think here in Australia, the centre-right, the conservative voices, we're very good at thought leadership. We're very good at think tanks. We've got the IPA, we've got the CIS, we've got Menzies Research Centre and many others who do brilliant research and that kind of thing. But in terms of boots on the ground and really giving our movement teeth, this has been something that we've lacked for quite some time. Whereas the left, as becomes more apparent, it seems, with every passing day, they're very organised, they're very well resourced, and they've got plenty of boots on the ground. So that's what, like I say, we're only 18 months old, but that's what Advance Australia aspires to, and that's what we're working hard on. As you can see on our website that you were just browsing a little earlier, what our beliefs are. So we're looking to, basically, if you look at these beliefs, you realise these are exactly what the left are attacking. So promoting personal freedoms, that's something that we see constantly under fire. Fighting political correctness, which I like to say is just fancy wording for lies. If you look at the politically correct speech, and even the policies that are pushed around political correctness, they are just devoid of truth. Family values, always, that's the bedrock of any flourishing society, as we well know. Ensuring a safe and secure nation, especially in today's environment, post-COVID, where we've got a lot of state sovereignty issues on the boil, as Australia's everyday Aussies are just becoming a lot more aware of our stance in the world and our vulnerabilities, many of those being thanks to poor decisions by the government at some point or other. And lastly, creating economic opportunity, which is exactly what the left seem very passionate about opposing with all the red and green tape that they're constantly pushing on small businesses, big
Yeah.
businesses. As you would know, they're very big on class envy, the left, and they love to tear down anyone, even if your wealth is due to the fact that you studied hard, worked very hard. The rich are the enemy in the eyes of the left.
Yeah, absolutely. What do you think the main lies of GetUp are? And maybe let's put this another way. Let me take that question back and rephrase it. What do you think the main points of ignorance are amongst GetUp followers?
Gosh, it'd be hard to know where to start with that. So I'm signed up to GetUp emails, obviously, and I read their missives, and they really do seem to prey on good-hearted people who believe that they're genuinely making a change. And I believe that the ignorance around the entire left's movement, they very craftily co-opted the language of compassion and equality, and even love itself. And these are things that good-hearted people, even you or I, were we less woke, would be attracted to. And this is the bedrock of all the policies that they push, whether it's around climate change and the fact that this is about your children's children, and the world's going to blow up unless you do something, and you're extremely selfish if you don't. And so many of the policies that they push, whether it's around LGBTIQ rights, or the more technical policies. So currently a lot around energy. The government's in big trouble for trying to push gas now. It's all about this evil fossil fuel society and everyone just patting each other on the back. They're also very big on identity politics, and I find it extremely divisive. But of course, the left don't see it that way. They see it as standing up for minorities, etc., and so on, where it is, in fact, the politics of the left is incredibly, incredibly divisive.
Well, we're certainly seeing that in global news at the moment, not just in Minneapolis or Minnesota, but right across the continent of US and into various other nations around the world, and now imported at the prodding of green extremists here in Australia. This politics of resentment, this politics of grievances, polarizing, inflaming, dividing people. Pouring fuel on it all, and then lighting a match, standing back and saying, "See, we told you," as if there's any evidence or truth to what they say at all. One of the policies that I find a lot of Australians unaware of, and I'm going to, I guess, talk probably more about those who are left of centre and inclined to be more easily led astray by GetUp manipulative rhetoric, is the concept of sovereign risk, and what exactly impact that has on the poor, the vulnerable, the underprivileged people who are exposed to economic hard times here in Australia. What kind of policies are being advocated by the left which jeopardize and weaken the sovereign risk which people assess when they're thinking about doing business with Australia?
Okay, well, what the left are managing to deceive Australians into, say, as you know, we're the world's biggest coal exporter. However, they're saying, look, we can still have zero emissions by 2050. And our coal emissions, our coal exports rather, won't be affected by this, simply because those emissions are accounted to whichever country is actually burning the coal, as opposed to the country, Australia in this instance, who's digging it up, mining it, and exporting it. So this is another nice farcical trick of the left to convince us they're actually doing a good deed here. But zero emissions by 2050, or indeed by ever, in and of itself is an extremely damaging policy. And thankfully, Energy Minister Angus Taylor came out very recently saying that that is not a policy of the Australian government. However, that is something that they aspire to, especially when it comes to our international commitments, constantly talking about Paris, which I was great to hear Senator Matt Canavan, who's an absolute coal champion from Queensland, recently say, look, I once supported Paris, and now I'm saying we've got to get out of this for the sake of, if we want to get manufacturing back off the ground, which is essential to any sovereign nation, then we have to have cheap, reliable power. And we can't do that at the moment if we're still going after all this radical green left ideology and pandering to the left on this issue. A lot more to say about manufacturing.
Everything you've just said, pandering to the left, affordable energy, begs the question, what's your position on nuclear energy? Are you for it or against it? What do you see the pros and cons being in this debate?
Goodness. Get comfortable, Dave. My goodness. Look, very passionate. That's it. Lean back, order some snacks. Very passionate about nuclear, and I think it's very unfortunate that we haven't done more about this previously. Australia has been talking about nuclear since the 1950s. We've danced with this thing constantly. Then in 1998, we saw the Howard government ban it. Not that we had any to ban, but even banning the prospect of nuclear power in Australia. And essentially that was done to pander to the anti-nuclear movement of the time, which it's just so ridiculous now what we're doing to pander to the anti-coal.
I actually didn't know that Howard had banned it. I knew it was banned, but I didn't know that that was one of the other regrettable things that Howard took off us.
Sure. Look, great man. Don't mean to speak ill of him, but yes.
No,
that was
I do,
definitely...
but I mean, out of his whole administration, I can only think of a couple of things. On the balance, one of the best prime ministers we've had, but that doesn't make him beyond criticism.
No, not at all. Not at all. I don't think any prime minister should be.
Agreed.
So, yeah, 1998 banned it, and then seemed to reconsider in and of themselves, because they commissioned a report in 2006, an inquiry, I should say, which then ended up being a report, as they do, into nuclear and the feasibility of it in Australia. Now, this guy, Swakovsky, who headed up the report and is still talking about nuclear in Australia as recently as last year, came back to us and basically said, look, this is a pretty good idea. This is how much it'll cost, and did a brilliant report. I recommend anyone read it, because a lot of it's still relevant, although being 2006, it's now quite outdated. But essentially, what's still very clear of nuclear power is that it directly kicks out of the ballpark what we call the trilemma when we're looking at any energy source, and that is affordability, sustainability, environmental sustainability, and how much of it we can make. Like, is this reliable? Is it affordable? And is it environmentally sustainable? Nuclear power is just unmatched. If you're talking about those three, then there's simple facts like Australia has the largest known deposits of uranium in the world, which, as we know, is the fuel that these nuclear power plants use. We just keep sending it overseas to power other people's, much like our coal, sending it overseas to power other people's nuclear plants. And there are arguments against nuclear. I think quite a lot of them are antiquated now. When I ask everyday Aussies about nuclear and what do you think of nuclear, a lot of them just immediately go to Fukushima, Chernobyl, and those disasters in the past. But indeed, they are in the past. One was due to a natural disaster and another due to human error, which arguably never had to happen. So it's just absolutely brilliant. Also, when you look at the
Can I
capacity.
interrupt you on that?
Yeah, go for it.
And let me play the devil's advocate.
Oh, please do.
So human error, natural disaster, what's going to,
Mhm.
those sound like hard things to guard against. What would be the safeguards against human error and natural disaster here in Australia, repeating those outcomes?
Well, here in Australia, we don't have tsunamis. We don't have earthquakes. We do have bushfires. However, we're very luckily, we're not someone who has tornadoes ripping through, say, in parts of America. Many of the natural disasters that you can list, Australia is extremely blessed not to be familiar with a vast number of them. So I think that one is, especially depending on where we build them, is not so much a concern. And in regards to human error, as Swakowski says, he says, look, the risk of that happening now with the change in technologies, how advanced we are, etc., and so on, the risk of that happening now is literally non-negligible. Like you can't even, it's so tiny, you couldn't even quantify it.
Statistically irrelevant.
Indeed.
Now, what about the disposal of the waste products after we've produced the nuclear energy? That's a big question that a lot of people have. Is that another antiquated question? I don't know if it was you I was talking to or somebody else was alluding, and I know nothing about this, so if you please enlarge. Apparently you can actually use the waste now for creating more energy.
Yes, I think that was me.
Okay, good.
So anyone who's watched Bill Gates's recent doco, it's available on Netflix. It's very well informed, and each episode, by the way, not a massive Bill Gates fan. There's plenty of things people have against Bill Gates.
that was
I'm
hanging there.
simply saying it's a very interesting doco. And one of those, I think it's the third episode, is about nuclear and how they've now found ways to be able to reuse nuclear waste, which is just brilliant. I mean, if it's a doco anyone's interested in watching, this is the guy who went to very brilliant minds in the world and said, I want to put I want to put toilet systems in slums so that less people die and hygiene is better. And he actually came up with multiple different ways to turn fecal matter into energy. There's just nothing we can't do with technology these days.
Wow.
It's absolutely incredible. So nuclear waste, less of a problem.
Except provide green energy, renewable and baseload.
Sorry?
Nothing we can't do with technology except provide green, renewable baseload energy.
Exactly. But at least with nuclear energy, it is emissions free. So you'd think it would appease the green left. You'd think they'd be excited about this product, but like everything else,
I don't know why they're stuck in the mud on nuclear. I don't know what their objection is, ideologically or environmentally.
That's the problem with the left, Dave. You can't fact check them. They don't deal in facts. It's all about feelings, unicorns, never-ending welfare payments, a massive money tree called the government.
The magic pudding is an Australian myth that the Greens actually believe in. So one of the things I've heard about nuclear energy is that it's massively expensive to build. The upfront initial development costs are prohibitive in their own rights, and we'd be, I don't know, compared to the other options. I guess the radical left will argue that for the cost of nuclear power plants around Australia, we could develop green, reliable, environmentally friendly baseload energy solutions.
Could we though? Look, one of the cons of nuclear energy is most definitely the upfront cost. They're not cheap to build, but boy, do they ever pay for themselves. And again, I just wish we'd got started earlier because we could be enjoying the benefits of it by now. But a great thing to know about nuclear energy is its capacity. So for when you look at the capacities of the different energies, you've got nuclear, you've got gas coming in second, and then you've got coal coming in third. Now, nuclear is 93.5% capacity, and the second comer, gas, is just 53%. Coal is something like 56%, sorry, gas is 56%. Coal is something like 43%. So it's getting weaker and weaker. And to put that in perhaps better understandable terms, a gigawatt of nuclear can't be replaced by a gigawatt of gas or coal. You'd need 2 plants to be working around the clock to be able to produce enough power to equal what a nuclear power plant does.
That's
and
interesting.
at a time when we're trying to phase out coal, unfortunately, I think that's ridiculous. On any given day here in Australia, 75% of Australia's electricity generation is thanks to coal. But Labor seem to love blowing up our coal mines. And the Green left are so passionate about getting rid of this. And they seem to be making great headway. As you've said, we've got these massive subsidies propping up renewables that are doing little more than trashing our grid and supplying us with very expensive, extremely unreliable power. But if we're going to phase out coal, nuclear makes a lot of sense, which is exactly what Swakowski has once again said, just saying if you guys are serious about getting rid of coal, you need baseload power to be able to prop up your renewables. So here's your next best option.
How many nuclear power plants would we need? Would we need one on the East Coast, one on the West Coast? How would that work?
So what Swakowski, who is the expert when it comes to nuclear in Australia, he's obviously been looking at this for quite some time. Basically, the window of opportunity for us to produce the really massive ones has gone. And what they're now focusing on is these, what they call modular nuclear power stations. And he's suggesting that we'll do up about 26 of those. 15 years ago, he said they could be up and running in 15 years. But here we are with no nuclear power still. So different sites have been suggested. They're listed on the Australia Nuclear website. There is a whole website, actually, which geeks like me really enjoy going through everything. But yes, such strong arguments. And that's another one, because here in Australia, we do have areas we're not a densely populated country, so we do have areas, and much like mining towns where we've created entire towns around these mines that we rely so heavily on, I believe something very similar to that would crop up if, hopefully when, we get a few of these nuclear power plants.
Why would the window of opportunity have closed? What's changed other than our terrain and natural resources? You mentioned a window of opportunity. What's that, and why is it closed?
I believe Swakowski was referring to just the frame of time. We now know better what would suit us. Had we built them back in the day, we would have opted for the bigger, clunkier. But as you know, with the rate technology moves, that's what he's now saying. Look, back in the day, I may have suggested that. But as recently as last year, he's saying, what we'd look at is these smaller modular ones dotted around the country. So I think also one of the cons of nuclear is, as we've already touched on, people's misunderstanding of nuclear in it being dangerous, or having radioactive material lying around. And I think it would really help to get across to people just how common nuclear is. It's in 30 countries across the globe. It powers 10% of the entire world's power. When you think about that, that's an astronomical amount of power. If we look at our mates in the US, nuclear has been their workhorse for 6 decades now. It produces 20% of their entire, and when you think of the US, and how much power would be required with all their industry, not to mention the millions of people. That's a lot of power, and they rely very heavily on nuclear to produce a fifth of their entire output. So I think if we can get this kind of information across to people and help them understand that this is actually not just Fukushima and Chernobyl, there's a lot more to this, and a great many countries are benefiting enormously from nuclear power. We're just missing out.
And as to the current cost of electricity, is it still the case that South Australia has the most expensive unit price electricity in the world?
I believe so. But see, they're also the state who has done away with every single coal-fired power station. So what do you expect if you get rid of your base load? We know that renewables aren't yet. Maybe one day there will be. They're not strong enough to supply a nation with reliable 24/7 power. And unfortunately, we've seen bills across the board, electricity bills double in Australia because of this ridiculous obsession in a nation that's only responsible for 1.3% of global emissions. Why would we do this to ourselves? Why would we effectively neuter our nation's prosperity in the name of getting rid of 1.3% of emissions? I keep telling people.
And how much cheaper would electricity be if we were completely, well, let's say 50% nuclear powered?
That's hard to say. Not something I know off the top of my head, but it is one of the cheapest. So like I say, when we compare it to others, it is the trifecta all in one. The reliability, the affordability, the environmentally sustainable. We can all thank nuclear for ticking those three boxes, which literally cannot be said to the same degree of any other energy source. It just can't. Much like its capacity, which is, practically double gas, more than double coal. So, yeah, definitely a lot to be said for nuclear.
Could nuclear power, cheap electricity, be part of the ingredients to revitalising Australia's manufacturing industry?
Massively. In fact, it's vital. Absolutely vital. We recently saw our government, I think the week before last, come out with a draft plan, which was very gas heavy. There was a mention of nuclear. They just keep stringing us along with that little ray of hope. And indeed, Energy Minister Angus Taylor did say just last year that he didn't count out nuclear. And if there was a comprehensive business case brought to the government for a nuclear system in Australia, they wouldn't rule it out. But to my knowledge, unfortunately, no one has come forward with said comprehensive business case. So we do know that lifting the moratorium on nuclear power in Australia isn't out of the question in the eyes of the Morrison government. At least that's what they've told us. And we do know that we desperately
So they're going to talk about talking about nuclear.
Indeed. And as you would know, Dave, politics 101 is the less you intend to do about something, the more you've got to talk about it. So I'm not taking false hope from this, but I was heartened by the fact that it even got a mention in this pathway forward in terms of energy in Australia. This is talking about, energy in the recovery map going forward.
Yep.
Basically. And like I say, it was very gas heavy. New coal mines, power stations didn't even get a mention, which I think is utterly ridiculous.
Economic suicide.
75% of our electricity on a daily basis comes from coal. So the fact that we're not even talking about replacing any of this baseload power. There's a lot to be said about gas, but as, again, the wonderful Senator Matt Canavan has pointed out to the Australian people, gas is expensive. We're not comparing apples with apples. If we compare our gas to America's gas, geographically, it's very different.
Yeah, I heard that.
Yeah, and in terms of comparing it to coal, best case scenario, we get gas at $6 a gigajoule. which is more than 10 times the cost of brown coal.
Wow.
And more than double the cost of black coal. So
Electricity will go up again.
Yeah, economically, what are we thinking? Now it's got 50% less emissions. So you can only guess that this move was perhaps made to satisfy the Green Left lobby. But again, this is just utter idiocy when you consider how desperately we need baseload power. Our manufacturing capacity or lack thereof has now been identified as a national security issue. We desperately need cheap baseload power, and now here we are touting gas instead of coal, even though coal is cheaper, simply because it's considered dirtier. And here we are in a nation that's responsible for just 1.3% of emissions. Again, bending over backwards. And it's mainstream Australia that pays for it. It's you and me on our electricity bills will be getting this.
Now, one of the things you've mentioned just then in talking about revitalising our manufacturing industry is the fact that its need for revitalising, the current poor state that it's in, thanks to a globalised, specialised economy, is that we've outsourced a lot of our manufacturing to China. Now, that brings, I guess, to my mind, one of my favourite ideas, which is national sovereignty or nationalism. Not extremist nationalism, but the good old patriotic version of nationalism, which it says we care about everybody, but our first responsibility is to our neighbours, to the people in our family, before we start looking after people on the other side of the world, while still caring about people on the other side of the world and doing our best without neglecting those at home. What sovereignty factors are at risk with the Australian-China relationship at the moment, and what does Advance Australia suggest good policy would look like to move forward and secure some of our independence and reliance on ourselves?
Well, you've already raised manufacturing, Dave, and this is an incredibly big one. Australians are now more than ever aware of the fact that we don't make stuff here. That's something that the pandemic made abundantly clear.
I like cheap stuff. Forgive me for interrupting, but part of what I advocate is the benefit to consumers, which are quite often the poor and vulnerable people, from cheap stuff. Everybody's got a TV, a microwave, a car, and all these because of international manufacturing.
Indeed, but one of the reasons why it is so expensive here is because of the red tape, the green tape, the lack of reliable power, etc., and so on. There are many measures that our government could make to encourage this capacity, and I hope they get moving on it very quickly, because like I say, this has been brought to the attention of the Australian people to a great degree over the course of this pandemic. Now, we've never been a massive boom manufacturing company, but at least during the 90s and during the noughties, manufacturing in Australia managed to grow by 10% each decade, whereas since 2010, we've managed to shrink. Sorry?
That recently, we had a growing manufacturing industry. That's fascinating.
We did.
I thought it was a relic of the 80s.
Well, it was probably even better back then. But as recently as that, yes, it was still growing. And then we hit 2010, and since then we've managed to shrink it by 5%. So a lot of work needs to be done here to make us less and less reliable on others. We all believe in free trade. We're great advocates for free trade. But when it comes to things like pharmaceuticals and realizing we don't have them on hand here, we don't have the means to produce them here. One thing I recently shared on social media was what's called the ECI. And this thing measures each country's capacity to manufacture things, and not just how many things they can manufacture, but the complexity of what they're able to make in their country. Do you want to guess where Australia slides in? what number we are world ranking? It's pretty depressing.
Then no, I don't want to guess.
Okay, so
yeah.
we scrape in at number 59 between Lithuania and Kazakhstan.
Wow.
Pretty unbelievable.
Something we beat Kazakhstan in then, as opposed to our education. Something we beat Kazakhstan in as opposed to our education standards.
Look, in other standards, we rate much highly, can confirm. However, in this particular one, that's got to be a great big wake-up call to us as Aussies. We call ourselves a sovereign nation, but if you can't make stuff here, then we've really, at the hands of free trade, have we sold our sovereignty down the river? And
but
in
is
many
it really
cases,
free trade? Quite often when we hear these saying of free trade agreements, they're not actually, hey, let's throw away the rules and just do business with each other. There's actually a whole bunch of rules that are put into these free trade agreements, which in themselves cede national sovereignty and create all kinds of swaps and incentives. That kind of the opposite of free trade.
Indeed, and I'd say never more so than deals we make with China. And we have several members of parliament who are outspoken about this, and many journos, particularly in the Australian, are flocking around this as well, just saying, look, for so many years we've thought that China would come to the party, would embrace democracy, would embrace some Western values, would become more like us as the decades passed. That just hasn't happened. They are a communist dictatorship.
Of course.
They think very differently to us. They operate very differently to us. And one of the ways I think this is really apparent in our systems of government is our governments have to spend each 3-year term or 4-year, if you're state, focusing on winning the next term. The Chinese Communist Party isn't worried about losing the next election. They are hell-bent on building a dynasty that will last forever. Whereas when do you hear of our leaders talking about Australia 100 years from now, Australia 50 years from now? And this plays back into the whole nuclear conversation. We have to build an Australia that has reliable, affordable, environmentally sustainable energy. What's the best?
We care so little about the future, we steal from it. We get future generations to pay for the comfort of living today.
Indeed. And none more guilty than the left. We saw them come out when our government rolled out these emergency measures to look after millions of Australians in this terrible time when uncertainty was rife. Doubling New Start welfare payments, free daycare, etc., and so on. GetUp and the like were literally posting on their social medias and sending out emails saying these are great measures, but we need to make them permanent because it looked so much like their socialist dream. They were pouncing on it, saying, "Well, this is the way it's. We've always said it should always be." But like you say, you're robbing from the future. When I look at the debt that we've run up during this time and potentially what our children's children could be paying off, and yet this is what the left are championing. They're not thinking of the future.
It's not even the future is probably too impersonal a word for the reality, because that's future Dave's problems, kind of like my credit card. But the problem's actually Dave's grandchildren. It's going to be a generation that's paying for 2020. A whole generation, people that aren't born yet, don't have a vote yet, are having money spent on their behalf without their consent. It's immoral, intergenerational theft. And one of the things I really, really applaud John Howard and John Anderson for, that together their government might have a couple of digs at things that they did, like banning discussions about nuclear energy, but they ended the intergenerational theft, paid off all the debt, and set us up for a strong future. And then we had Kevin Rudd. But
Kevin 07, what a terrible thud it was for the nation.
And you know what? Let's be honest, the Conservative governments have continued to spend like drunken sailors, not been fiscally
Fiscally.
disciplined. Say fiscally disciplined 3 times fast. But, we're continuing to borrow, like intergenerational theft is no longer an objection. And that's a great shame. So, yeah. Look, final question. And this is, I guess, indulgent for you. What does Liz Storer want to do if you had the ability to make any policy change on any area across federal lines? What would you change if you could change it and make it stick?
I'd have to say at the moment, energy, because it plays into absolutely everything. This is the lifeblood of any nation. You can't function without it, and the decisions that are being made both on state and federal levels around energy are, like I say, just absolutely flooring our nation's prosperity. Prices are going up, and the effectiveness of the power that's being made available to people is going down. This is affecting our industry. It's affecting our manufacturing. We need to get this right, and we're never going to do that for as long as we're listening to the green left lobby. It's just incredible how much power they've managed to wield, convincing everyone the world is going to blow up. I tell everyone, if you believe in global warming, if you believe in man-made global warming, write to China, write to India. They are the 2 biggest offenders on the world stage when it comes to emissions. So if that is your concern, Australia isn't your concern. What we need to do, as you said earlier, is look after our own. And that does not mean trying to chip away at our ridiculous 1.3% of global emissions.
Yeah, and that's if we manage to get a shaving off that. Not even all of it, but all of it would still be a drop in the ocean.
Indeed.
So
we could start
specifically
living in
on
caves
nuclear,
tomorrow. It really wouldn't make a difference because we're Australia.
specifically on energy, you said energy would be the policy you'd change, but specifically do you think legalizing and immediately commencing construction on nuclear power plants would be the closest thing we have to a silver bullet, or was there some other policy specifically?
Look, as you can tell from the rest of this interview, very passionate about nuclear. I don't see that happening anytime soon. Would if I could, but certainly with these new modular power stations that we're now talking about using nuclear, there's a lot going up overseas that we'll want to keep an eye on for a few years.
Where are they going up?
I'm trying to remember now. Swakovsky he does a small list of who's now utilizing these, because we'd want to go with the latest technologies.
Yeah,
so
of course.
the nuclear that's been humming away for decades past and still doing a brilliant job, because that's nuclear for you. But he's looking at the new ones, which is what we'd want to get. And he wants to use these guys as guinea pigs. Which we're prone to do. So that, as much as I'd love to snap my fingers and get nuclear off the ground, I think we have to build new coal-fired power stations. We know that new coal-fired power stations actually produce 30% less emissions. So if you're passionate about emissions, then let's still just build new coal-fired power stations. We don't have any other source of baseload power in Australia that does quite the same as coal for the same price.
And we've got the cleanest coal in the world.
Indeed. We're sitting on a gold mine of it, and yet, much like our uranium, we love packing it off overseas to power other people's power systems instead of our own. So, like I say, there were absolutely no mentions of any new coal power stations in the government's latest plans, and that's just shameful.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for joining me today. It's been a great conversation.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks again for having me.
So you can find more about Advance Australia at their website, advanceaustralia.org.au. Make sure you follow them on social media, jump on their email list and see what they've got to say, so you can decide for yourself. That's it for this episode of Pellowe Talk. Thank you very much for tuning in. And as always, thank you to the Pellowe Talk Partners for making this possible with a small monthly donation. You can become a Pellowe Talk partner. You can also subscribe to the newsletter, see past interviews and articles, most of which are evergreen. They're relevant to a whole bunch of issues which just aren't going away, and are long conversations that are very important for us to be having in the public square. Where you can get all of that is at my website, davepellowe.com. So head to davepellowe.com, sign up for the newsletters, become a Pellowe Talk partner, and let's keep having these important discussions. I'll see you in the comments section.
Will we see an end to all this pain? Oh, it's not enough to do nothing. It's time for us to do something.